The plan seemed simple on paper. Churchill, buoyed by the early naval successes of the Royal Navy, imagined that sheer firepower could sweep aside any defenses. He assumed the Dardanelles were merely a choke point that, once bombarded, would allow a fleet to pass unchallenged. The plan ignored crucial realities. The strait was narrow, heavily mined, and reinforced by Ottoman artillery, manned by soldiers who were prepared, disciplined, and highly motivated. This was not a simple waterway. It was a defensive bottleneck designed to punish anyone who underestimated it. The British Navy sailed in confident formations, their battleships presenting large, visible targets. Minesweeping operations were minimal, poorly coordinated, and often conducted under fire. Ships struck mines repeatedly, with catastrophic results. The flagship, the HMS Irresistible, along with the HMS Ocean and HMS Bouvet, were either damaged or sunk in the opening days. Every loss exposed a fatal flaw in the original plan. Naval power alone could not overcome prepared defenses. The Admiralty had miscalculated both the technical challenges and the resolve of the defenders. Churchill's arrogance compounded the error. He assumed the Ottoman forces would collapse under a display of firepower. He underestimated the defensive ingenuity of Turkish commanders, who placed artillery in elevated positions along the strait and camouflaged gun positions to maximize effectiveness. Each ship that approached was met with precise, coordinated fire. The Ottoman artillery inflicted heavy losses on the fleet while minimizing exposure. The sea route, meant to be a swift corridor to Russia, became a death trap. As the naval assault failed, the plan shifted almost as an afterthought to a land invasion. Troops were landed at Gallipoli in April 1915 with the goal of capturing the high ground, cutting the Ottoman forces, and allowing the fleet to pass safely. However, the landings revealed another fundamental misjudgment. The planners had no real understanding of the terrain or the difficulty of amphibious operations. The beaches were narrow, backed by steep ridges and ridged cliffs. Soldiers came ashore under heavy fire, immediately pinned down by machine guns and artillery. The simple concept of landing and advancing inland proved impossibly difficult. Logistics worsened the catastrophe. Supplies, reinforcements, and artillery had to be brought onto the exposed beaches under constant threat. Ships could not remain offshore for long due to Ottoman artillery. Every crate of food, every rifle, and every shell arrived slowly, often under fire, hampering the already tentative progress of the infantry. Casualties mounted before any meaningful advance could be made. The initial optimism of a rapid, decisive strike evaporated into a stalemate on the shorelines. The Gallipoli Peninsula quickly turned into a grinding battle of attrition. Trenches dug by the Allies mirrored those of the Western Front. Soldiers faced heat, disease, and a lack of clean water. Ottoman forces, holding the high ground, repelled repeated assaults with minimal losses in comparison. The Allies were trapped in a narrow corridor, unable to maneuver. While the defenders maintained strong observation points and interlocking fields of fire, every attempt to advance was costly, slow, and largely ineffective. The failure of the campaign was compounded by poor coordination among the Allies. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand units had differing operational doctrines, communication methods, and objectives. Planning was centralized but rigid, leaving little room for adaptive responses on the ground. Commanders on the beaches could not adjust quickly enough to the changing battlefield. The result was piecemeal assaults that fell into pre-prepared defensive zones, resulting in predictable and deadly repulses. Amphibious operations proved even more perilous than expected. Troops were landing on narrow beaches with little cover. Machine gun nests targeted every approach. The terrain amplified the defenders' advantage. Scaling the ridges meant climbing exposed slopes under constant fire. Soldiers were cut down before reaching the first lines of defense. The combination of misjudged naval capability and unassessed terrain amplified the campaign's failure. What was supposed to be a swift strike became a grinding, static slaughter. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in the opening months, and many more suffered from heat exhaustion, dysentery, and disease. The miscalculations in both planning and execution turned the campaign into a humanitarian catastrophe. Units were often ordered to repeat the same assault despite heavy losses. Morale fell as soldiers witnessed the futility of their efforts. What had been intended as a decisive strike became an exercise in endurance against impossible odds. the campaign also had strategic consequences far beyond the immediate losses. Failure at Gallipoli meant that the Dardanelles remained closed to Allied shipping, and Russia remained isolated from Western supply routes. Churchill's reputation suffered, leading to his temporary resignation from the Admiralty. Politically, the debacle created divisions within the British government, undermined confidence in military leadership, and became a rallying point for critics who argued that the war was mismanaged. The tactical failure rippled across the strategic landscape of World War I. The campaign illustrates the danger of overconfidence in a single strategy, especially when it ignores logistical, geographic, and human factors. It demonstrates how political pressure, personal ambition, and misjudgment of the enemy's capability can produce catastrophic outcomes. The naval assault was a textbook example of hubris meeting reality, and the land campaign compounded the error with further underestimation of terrain and defender resilience. Each step of the plan exposed the costs of assuming simplicity in complex operations. The role of human resilience was also highlighted. Ottoman forces under Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, displayed remarkable discipline and tactical ingenuity, turning a relatively small force into a highly effective defensive line. Their understanding of terrain, use of reinforcements, and effective counterattacks exemplified how skill, preparation, and morale can overcome even numerically superior enemies. In contrast, the Allied forces' failures were a lesson in how poor planning and overconfidence undermine even the best-trained armies. Gallipoli also forged new national identities. The heavy losses and extraordinary endurance of Australian and New Zealand Army Corps ANZAC troops became a foundational myth for both countries. The shared struggle, tragedy, and courage exhibited during the campaign became central to national memory and identity. Despite the operational failure, the campaign left a lasting cultural and historical legacy that shaped the sense of nationhood for decades. In sum, the Gallipoli campaign was a combination of audacious ambition, severe miscalculation, and brutal reality. A naval shortcut that ignored mines, artillery, and defensive planning led to a catastrophic land operation that ground into a stalemate. The cost was staggering in lives, morale, and political consequence. Yet, amid the failure, lessons emerged about the importance of preparation, the value of resilience, and the unexpected forging of national identities from shared suffering. Gallipoli serves as both a cautionary tale of hubris and a study in how human spirit can endure even the worst strategic blunders. If you found this analysis compelling, like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. The story of Gallipoli teaches us not just about war, but about the costs of underestimating complexity and the enduring power of courage under fire. This is just the first part of the full account, and in the next segment, we'll explore the failed amphibious landings and the deadly stalemate that followed, revealing more about why this campaign became one of the deadliest mistakes of World War I. The naval assault on the Dardanelles was meant to be the quick, decisive stroke that would open a path to Constantinople and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The plan was audacious. The British and French fleets believed that a concentrated bombardment of the forts and artillery lining the strait would neutralize any threat, allowing the battleships to pass through unscathed. On paper, it looked like a masterstroke. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The Allied fleet approached the narrow strait with confidence, but the Ottomans were prepared. Under the command of capable officers, they had laid a dense network of naval mines and positioned artillery on commanding heights, perfectly concealed behind natural ridges and camouflaged emplacements. Each ship became a moving target, exposed to both hidden artillery fire and the invisible threat of underwater mines. The combination proved deadly. Almost immediately, ships began to strike mines. The HMS Irresistible and HMS Ocean were heavily damaged, while the French battleship Bouvet struck a mine and sank almost instantly. Explosions ripped through the hulls, sending sailors into freezing waters under fire. The naval commanders realized too late that the defenses had been underestimated, and that naval gunnery alone could not neutralize such a layered and well-prepared defensive system. The failure of this initial naval bluff had immediate and cascading consequences. Morale on the ships plummeted. Sailors and officers alike understood that the strait could not be forced without incurring catastrophic losses. The illusion of a swift, clean victory evaporated. Politically, the failure embarrassed the British Admiralty, and placed Winston Churchill, the campaign's architect, under intense scrutiny. What was meant to be a show of naval might turned into a visible, humiliating defeat. With the naval path blocked, the Allies faced a hard choice: abandon the operation entirely or attempt a costly, unplanned land invasion. Choosing the latter, they quickly realized that amphibious operations on the Gallipoli Peninsula were far more complex than anticipated. The terrain was a natural fortress, with steep ridges, cliffs, and narrow beaches exposed to Ottoman fire. Troops landed under constant artillery and machine gun fire, often pinned on the beaches for hours, unable to advance. The failed naval assault also exposed weaknesses in Allied coordination and planning. Communication between ships and land forces was slow and unreliable. Minesweeping operations were insufficient, and the pace of reinforcements and supplies could not match the immediate demands of the landing troops. Every logistical challenge became magnified because the initial assumption that the Navy could clear the way had been proven false. This early failure set the tone for the entire campaign. Instead of a rapid, decisive operation, Gallipoli turned into a prolonged stalemate. Casualties mounted quickly, not just from combat, but from exposure, disease, and exhaustion. The combination of poor planning, overconfidence, and underestimation of the enemy's capability ensured that the campaign would be remembered as one of the deadliest and most strategically flawed operations of World War I. The Ottoman defenders, under capable leadership, capitalized on the naval failure. They fortified positions, moved reserves strategically, and prepared for the inevitable land invasion. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, emerged as a key figure in organizing the defense, demonstrating tactical foresight and efficient use of terrain. Every misstep by the Allies only strengthened the resolve and advantage of the Ottoman forces. In essence, the failed naval bluff was the first domino in a chain of disasters. It shattered illusions of Allied supremacy at sea, forced a complex and poorly prepared land invasion, and highlighted the dangers of overconfidence in military planning. What was intended to be a quick, brilliant maneuver instead became a costly lesson in hubris, logistics, and the underestimated power of a well-prepared defender. The land invasion of Gallipoli marked the point where Churchill's grand naval plan collided with the harsh reality of warfare. Once the naval assault failed, the Allies were forced into a full-scale amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula, a mission that was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The beaches, narrow and rugged, offered no natural cover for advancing troops. The cliffs and ridges rising immediately from the shoreline provided the Ottoman defenders with an almost impregnable advantage. The ANZAC forces Australian and New Zealand Army Corps were among the first to land at what became known as ANZAC Cove. They stepped off the landing boats into a torrent of rifle and machine gun fire from soldiers entrenched above them. The Ottoman troops had anticipated every likely landing site and had fortified positions with overlapping fields of fire. Every step forward meant climbing exposed slopes while under constant bombardment. In many sectors, soldiers were pinned for hours just trying to reach the base of the cliffs. Coordination during the landing was chaotic. Units became disoriented. Some landed at the wrong beaches, and many small boats were lost in the surf. Communication lines were minimal or non-existent, making it nearly impossible for commanders to adapt to unfolding battlefield conditions. Supply chains faltered immediately. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were slow to arrive, while wounded men piled up on the beaches. The initial assumption that the landings would meet minimal resistance proved catastrophically false. The terrain forced the fighting into a form of static warfare reminiscent of the Western Front, but in far worse conditions. Soldiers dug shallow trenches where they could find space, often under enemy fire, and any attempt to advance up the slopes was met with devastating volleys. Casualties mounted quickly. Unlike in previous amphibious operations, there was no immediate room for maneuver. Every meter of ground had to be painfully won, often at the cost of hundreds of lives. The Ottoman defenders, under Mustafa Kemal, demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness. By holding the high ground, they could concentrate fire on narrow assault points while keeping reserves ready to plug gaps in the line. They maximized the natural advantages of the terrain, turning every ridge and gully into a defensive stronghold. Even when Allied troops managed to capture small areas, the Ottomans counterattacked swiftly, often regaining lost positions and inflicting further casualties. The result was a brutal stalemate. Soldiers endured not only enemy fire, but also harsh environmental conditions: summer heat, rocky cliffs, limited water, and poor sanitation. Disease and exhaustion compounded the battlefield carnage. Small gains came at a staggering cost in human life, and morale began to deteriorate as the campaign stretched into months without decisive progress. This land invasion blunder illustrates the consequences of poor planning and underestimation of the enemy. The Allied forces assumed that numerical superiority and modern equipment would be sufficient to overcome the natural defenses. Yet they faced a well-prepared and highly motivated opponent in difficult terrain. The campaign devolved into trench warfare on steep slopes, where each advance required heroic effort but yielded minimal results. The Gallipoli Peninsula became a graveyard of strategic miscalculations. The landing beaches, once envisioned as a doorway to a quick victory, turned into killing zones where the combination of terrain, determined defense, and logistical failures created a protracted and bloody stalemate. Every lesson ignored from the failed naval assault was painfully reinforced during these landings. The Gallipoli campaign stands as one of the most costly failures of World War I, yet it also became the crucible in which national identities were forged for Australia and New Zealand. The initial strategic blunders, starting with the failed naval assault and compounded by the disastrous landings, led to a protracted campaign that consumed over 300,000 lives across all Allied forces. British, French, and ANZAC troops faced relentless Ottoman resistance, treacherous terrain, and harsh environmental conditions. Every inch of ground gained came at staggering human cost, and the High Command failed repeatedly to adapt their strategy to the realities on the peninsula. Despite the military disaster, the campaign had a profound and lasting cultural impact on the ANZAC forces, Australian and New Zealand soldiers facing nearly impossible odds, displayed extraordinary courage, perseverance, and solidarity. Under the command of inexperienced or overstretched officers, these troops were forced to endure extreme hardship, often improvising in the absence of adequate supplies, shelter, or medical care. They dug trenches on rocky slopes under constant enemy fire, fought to seize and hold positions in dense Turkish defenses, and faced the ever-present threat of disease and starvation. The sheer determination to survive and maintain cohesion amidst chaos became a defining characteristic of their military and cultural identity. The shared suffering of these soldiers created a deep bond that transcended the battlefield. They relied on one another for survival, forming units in which trust and mutual support were essential. This camaraderie, forged in the crucible of combat, became a foundational narrative for both nations. The heroism displayed in the face of overwhelming odds and the sense of honor in carrying out one's duty despite strategic mismanagement became central to the emerging national mythos. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became more than a military campaign. It became a story of resilience and emerging sovereignty. Though they were colonies of the British Empire, the ANZAC soldiers demonstrated a unique spirit and identity on the battlefield. Their experiences at Gallipoli marked the beginning of national consciousness, emphasizing values like courage, endurance, and mateship qualities that remain at the heart of ANZAC commemoration today. ANZAC Day, observed each year on April 25th, serves as a solemn remembrance of those who fought and died. But it also celebrates the birth of a national character shaped by collective struggle. The campaign's failure did not diminish the significance of the ANZAC effort. Rather, it amplified it. While Gallipoli did not achieve its strategic military objectives and is remembered as a catastrophic Allied miscalculation, the story of the soldiers' bravery and unity provided a rallying point for national pride. For many in Australia and New Zealand, the memory of the campaign became a moral victory, representing the courage and tenacity of their people, even in the face of strategic incompetence. This tragic campaign also highlighted the profound human cost of flawed planning and underestimation of the enemy. Soldiers endured brutal physical and psychological conditions: steep, rocky ridges, limited water, unsanitary trenches, extreme heat, and the omnipresent threat of Ottoman rifle and artillery fire. Every advance required extraordinary effort, and casualties mounted daily. The story of Gallipoli, therefore, is not only one of military failure, but also one of endurance, courage, and the shaping of national identity under extraordinary pressure. Gallipoli's legacy is thus dual. It is remembered as a monumental Allied strategic failure, Yet simultaneously as the defining moment for two emerging nations, the campaign forged a sense of unity, resilience, and national pride in Australia and New Zealand that continues to resonate. The soldiers' sacrifices became the cornerstone of each nation's narrative, providing a lasting example of how shared struggle and perseverance can define collective identity, even in the face of catastrophic military outcomes. The final act of the Gallipoli campaign, the withdrawal of Allied force, stands out as the only operation executed with competence and planning. After 9 months of relentless fighting, the Allies had gained little ground and suffered enormous casualties, with over 300,000 soldiers dead, wounded, or incapacitated. The landings and subsequent offensives had been plagued by poor intelligence, underestimated Ottoman defenses, and disastrous tactical decisions. Yet, in stark contrast to the chaos of the campaign itself, the evacuation was carried out with meticulous attention to detail, strategic patience, and a surprising level of discipline. The evacuation required careful deception to prevent the Ottoman forces from realizing the Allies were leaving. Commanders implemented elaborate ruses, including staged lighting of trenches, leaving food and equipment in positions that suggested ongoing occupancy, and maintaining routine artillery barrages at night. Soldiers were withdrawn in phases, with rearguards holding the line, while others embarked on ships under cover of darkness. This deliberate, measured approach ensured that not a single life was lost during the withdrawal. A remarkable achievement considering the scale of the forces involved and the previous 9 months of unrelenting attrition. This success underscores a stark contrast between the operational failures and a moment of competent planning. The lessons of Gallipoli were brutally clear. Careful preparation, humility in the face of the enemy, and adaptability are critical to military operations. The initial naval assault had been based on overconfidence and a misreading of the Ottoman defenses. The landings were executed without sufficient reconnaissance, and the commanders repeatedly underestimated both the terrain and the fighting capability of Mustafa Kemal's forces. In every phase except the evacuation, arrogance and impatience had dictated strategy, leading to catastrophic losses. Despite failing to achieve any of the campaign's strategic objectives, securing the Dardanelles, knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war, or establishing a direct supply line to Russia, the evacuation demonstrated that a well-planned and carefully executed operation could succeed even after months of mismanagement. It became the rare example of Allied competence in a campaign otherwise defined by misjudgment and hubris. Military historians often note that the lessons from Gallipoli, particularly the retreat, informed future amphibious operations, including the landings during World War II at Normandy. The importance of planning, intelligence, and deception was driven home by the stark contrast between the disastrous assaults and the flawless withdrawal. The human dimension of the evacuation was equally important. Troops who had endured the relentless hardships of Gallipoli's steep, rocky terrain, constant enemy fire, disease, and inadequate supplies were finally able to leave without additional loss of life. The psychological relief for soldiers, who had suffered under extreme conditions and witnessed the deaths of friends and comrades, was immense. While the campaign had forged national identity for Australia and New Zealand, it also left a deep imprint on the morale and discipline of the soldiers, demonstrating that even in failure, order and care for human life were possible. In the end, the Gallipoli campaign remains a study in contrasts. It was a testament to the dangers of overconfidence, the catastrophic consequences of underestimating a determined and prepared opponent, and the enormous human cost of ego-driven military planning. Yet it also offers a rare example of a successful operation in the midst of prolonged failure, the evacuation that saved thousands of lives and provided enduring lessons in military strategy. The campaign failed its original objectives, but succeeded in imparting a cautionary tale about leadership, preparation, and respect for both the enemy and the environment in which operations are conducted. For Australia and New Zealand, the campaign, including the evacuation, remains a defining moment of national identity. For historians, Gallipoli stands as a case study in strategic miscalculation, operational learning, and the stark consequences of hubris. The meticulous evacuation, quietly executed amid 9 months of suffering, is a final, ironic twist, the only part of the operation that lived up to military expectations, proving that competence and preparation could have changed the entire outcome if applied earlier. If you found this detailed analysis of Gallipoli enlightening, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. This marks the fifth and final part of our comprehensive Gallipoli series, concluding the story of one of World War I's most infamous campaigns.